Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations. It's June, so of course the forces rallying around James Martin are on the march at this time of year. Every year, in fact. I reported to you recently that James Martin got another endorsement from Pope Francis, far earlier in the month than usually happens. He is wrote the introduction to James Martin's new book on Lazarus, which uses Lazarus as a sort of metaphor for the interest and the crowd of people that James Martin is solely dedicated to serving. Francis wrote the introduction to the book, calling it a valuable work on theology and all the rest of it. It's his way of making sure that more Catholics will read the book and will then imbibe of the errors of James Martin. This shouldn't be surprising. This is the time of year where the secular world pushes that issue on all of us. And this issue, above all, is a secularization of the Church and of the Catholic faith. But that's not all that's going on here. You remember, Pope Francis used some spicy language that I can't repeat here to describe how there are too many people of a James Martin type in the Church. Or at least that's how everybody interpreted it. The record shows that he has used language, though not as crude, but language like that in the past to describe the presence of traditional priests and the aesthetics of traditional Catholicism. The lace, the Saturnos, and that all the sort of things we tend to think of when we think of what a traditional Latin Mass looks like in comparison to the contemporary Mass offered by the Church. And he did that with that in mind. And that became pretty obvious when in the days afterwards he not only retracted that statement, but retracted it multiple times, and then publicly told a young man with the James Martin tendencies to seek his vocation in seminary, despite having been rejected on those grounds in the past. Pretty clear he wasn't talking about the James Martin crowd when speaking about that, but this did not stop a lot of people from misinterpreting what he said. Not just traditionalists who initially celebrated this, but those of a James Martin persuasion themselves were pretty upset about this. And it's turning into something here, calling for more priests who are quietly like that to be public about it. It's a movement now starting among priests to help make it so all the very great many, hundreds if you take James Martin at his word, priests with those inclinations to step forward and make themselves known publicly. To make it very aware that the new order in the Church and the post-conciliar Church cannot survive without them. Here's what I mean by that. So, this comes from New Ways Ministry, an organization that is known to be heterodox and has been attempted to be punished by the U.S. bishops several times going back to the 1970s for rejecting the Church's authority on these matters. There you have an article on their website with this headline. James Martin-type priests respond to papal controversy, including an invitation for Pope Francis to meet with some of them. Fair enough, meet with him. I mean, you would expect that kind of act. I wonder how they feel now in the aftermath of his telling the young man to go to seminary, despite being, according to the Church, unfit for that office. But this is, again, part of a larger movement that's growing up now. You're going to see more and more of these stories, well past this month, of priests who have no place in the priesthood stepping forward and saying, no, I will be seen, I am of this type, hear me roar, basically. That's what you're going to see. And nowhere is it more evident than in this, what you're going to hear from this article. Quote, but the theologian's broader concern is with the Church's policy, that at least on paper rejects such men from seminaries over concerns they could not maintain celibacy or are malformed. He wrote in part, yet my experience of 40 years plus in the priesthood says this is simply not true. People of all inclinations live celibacy well. Priests of all inclinations struggle with living celibately at times. Sometimes these struggles give rise to scandal, both from James Martin types and from normal clergy. And closed, gossipy cliques, which some state are the real concern behind Francis's use of the offensive word, are not unique to such men, nor is a blanket ban on all such men a just solution to such a problem. This issue points to the deepest question that faces the Church. Are the James Martin crowd and all the variations of them fully equal members of the body of Christ? The debacle over Francis's remarks betrays the obvious answer. Not yet. Massingale, however, is hopeful and sees an opportunity after this week. All of this is part of the birth pains of a new openness in the Church, he writes before concluding with an appeal to Pope Francis to meet openly with such priests. What then do I believe the Pope should do? I believe the Pope needs to listen directly and with an open heart to such priests who faithfully serve the people of God. He needs to accompany us and smell like this part of his and the Lord's flock. He needs to hear of our joys and trials and attend our heartaches and our deep satisfactions. He needs to be inspired by us and at our times heroic fidelity. And we need to be inspired by him to listen to his perspective as one who is also committed to the service of God's people. Such an example of deep synodal accompaniment and spiritual listening would do more to heal the Church than the apologetic words of a papal press release. Listening to our voices would be a major step forward toward becoming a church where todos are truly welcome. End quote. I like actually how he used Francis's own logic against him. Not because I obviously don't endorse what he's saying, but I do like that he used Francis's own words against him. This synodality where all are welcome, everyone is welcome. We don't deny the Eucharist to anybody. We absolve anybody's sins who wants them in the confessional, even if they don't have a firm purpose of amendment. All that stuff is used against him. I think that's actually a really savvy way to handle this. But I want you to note something well. Last week in a live stream, I covered why men like this can't be admitted to the priesthood. The Vatican ruled unambiguously on the matter in 2005, more or less reaffirming what the Council of Trent has said on the matter. It's one of the first things Benedict XVI did after he became Pope. These advocates for James Martin-type priests reject the authority of the Church on the grounds of worldly logic. They do. That's what this whole program is a bringing of worldly logic and worldly values into the Catholic faith. We've seen this before if you're familiar with the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita. If you're familiar with that document, all of this should ring familiar to you. But the activism on this issue hasn't stopped either, and in a lot of ways has been overshadowed by the concern about some form of deaconettes being forced on the Church. That has been, for several months, a pretty common topic in Catholic circles. But check this out from Outreach Catholic, which is James Martin's organization, that works very hard on normalizing sins that crowd to heaven for justice in the Church. Making sure you know that there are many priests with these inclinations, there are many, many laity with these inclinations we aren't talking about the ones here who, at least among the laity, we're not talking about the ones who reject those inclinations, stay close to the sacraments, carry the cross that they have, and live in and exercise heroic virtue in such a way that we should all take note and mark them as heroes of the faith in the modern world. No, we're not talking about them. These are the outreach works to make those sins considered normal. Is a tacit rejection of the authority of Scripture, which James Martin has said he doesn't believe is inerrant anyway. He has said he thinks St. Paul got it wrong, which means he's formally a heretic, but he still is allowed to have a great deal of influence in the Church. But Outreach is his organization, something he founded. And we have an announcement on Twitter that comes from someone calling themselves Mike O'Loughlin, the executive director of that organization. They're holding a press conference in October 2024, meant to showcase how loud and proud that group of nominal Catholics are. And it's meant to help push the U.S. bishops to act in their favor. See, not coincidentally, this meeting is happening just before the annual meeting of the U.S. bishops in Baltimore that happens in early November. A meeting that used to be covered every year by Church Militant, if you remember. But here is the announcement he made on Twitter about this conference they're holding. It will tell you how popular this movement of theirs is. He says, quote, "We have reached capacity for Outreach 2024, surpassing our goal and setting a new registration record. But we have a waiting list. If you're interested in attending, please add yourself so we can be in touch when space opens up." End quote. Seems innocuous on the surface, doesn't it? But their conference is booked to capacity. It's happening just before the Synod of Bishops meets they meet every year in early November in Baltimore. It's happening just before that. And this topic will absolutely be something they talk about. Not the conference specifically, but the presence of priests of the James Martin type amongst them, as well as their Eucharistic revival and polarization in the church and the implications of the coming November contest and all that other stuff. They're going to be talking about all that stuff at their conference. What would you like to see those bishops talk about? What would you think their response should be to this topic specifically? The movement to make all those priests who, technically speaking, according to the Council of Trent and to the Vatican document released not even 20 years ago by Pope Benedict XVI, are men who shouldn't be in the priesthood in the first place. Their goal is to get these men to step forward and say, I am like this, you will accept me. And it makes such a show of it that without accepting them as they are, it would cripple the church. That's the goal, plainly said by James Martin. So I'm curious, what do you think about this? Let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't, it does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.